Is my microphone turned on? It is. Okay, good. The rumor is true. I am transgender. Just in case you didn't know. So now all of you can say that you have met a transgender person, even if you haven't. Turn that down. Okay, I'm going to stay here for just a minute. Okay. My thanks to the Radical Welcome Committee. Are they here? Where are they? Radical Welcome folks. You're okay. You're welcome here. Thank you, and thanks to Glenna very much for making it possible for me to be here and for sharing your microphone with me today. That's makes it possible for me to wander a little bit. But most of my thanks go to you for the privilege of your sharing a few moments of your life, listening to me. I consider that a privilege beyond most other privileges, and I want you to know that I'm grateful and thankful for the time that we'll spend together. I'm going to tell you some stories this morning. Everybody was wondering what the egg gatherer is. You have to sort of picture an office in not nearly as nice a facility as this. It's a nursing home, and it's the social worker's office, and it's kind of, steel case desks and plastic chairs, and the afternoon sun is filtering through dusty Venetian blinds, casting lines across the desk. Paul is there for his weekly appointment with Chauncey, the social worker of the nursing facility where Paul lives. Chauncey always looks forward to these times with Paul because he tells such wonderful stories. And today is absolutely no different. As he starts to reminisce about his life, Paul tells Chauncey about the time when his grandma told him that she thought that he was old enough to gather the eggs. Now, this was a wonderful time for Paul because for his whole life he had known that his grandmother had been the egg gatherer. She had been the one to go out to the hen house and come back with a wire basket full of eggs. And of course, he knew from experience that those eggs turned into all kinds of wonderful things. Breakfasts with the family with scrambled eggs and sausage and toast and some of Grandma's wonderful pound cake that came from all those eggs. And so he was truly excited about being given this new job. He felt proud and grown up. And so he grabbed the basket and ran right out of the house and ran across the yard to the hen house. And when he went in, all the hens were still on the roost. Do we have any egg gatherers here? Yeah, cool. So what he did, of course, is went to try to gather the eggs from underneath the hens. And if you have tried it, you know that doesn't work. The hens are very protective of those eggs, and little Paul, stuck his arm, tried to get it underneath, and boy, the squawking sound was unbelievable. And of course, then there was that pecking that came to his arms and hurt. It hurt really badly. And he felt very disappointed, and he was afraid that his grandmother would be disappointed in him. And so he tried another nest, and he went and found that it was no different. All of the hens were not going to let him gather the eggs. So he took the basket and was so disappointed and walked slowly back to the house and said, "Grandma, I'm sorry. I just couldn't do it. The chickens were mean." And she laughed, and she tousled his hair like she would do once in a while. And she said, Oh, Paul, that's not a problem. Let me tell you how to do it. You grab a handful of corn and you go out and you throw it in front of the hen house and wait for a little while for the sun to come up and warm the ground. The hens will come out and start scratching. Then you can go into the hen house and start to gather the eggs. And so that's what Paul did. He followed the instructions of his loving grandma and went out and gathered the eggs and brought them proudly back into the house. I want to share with you the stories of 3 friends of mine, people I have come to know over the space of decades and whose lives matter a great deal to me, and who illustrate in one way what I think Jesus is trying to draw us to understand when we talk about how we are gathered here today. The first person, whose name I have to remember, I wrote these out, but I never remember names. I'm not like Glenna. Glenna remembers names. She remembers. She remembers the names of everybody, and I have to look at my name tag to remember my own. Recently, Bishop Gene Robinson. Are any of you familiar with him? He's the. Okay. We have fans in here. Okay. Bishop Robinson wrote a wonderful piece on the website for the Center for American Progress on welcoming our transgender community, and it's very worth reading. If you go to the Center for American Progress and look up Gene Robinson's article on transgender welcome, you will find it there. And he, in the article, is struggling with his own ministry and the struggle with the Episcopal Church to embrace him as a bishop, and how that has played out, and then how the lives of transgender people are beginning to sort of filter onto the stage or into the spotlight of the church, and how these people need to be welcomed. And he reflects on how churches come to accept transgender folks, and finds that there are 2 very different ways that churches deal with issues related to gender. And it has everything to do with how the churches... Are you going to sit up here? You want to sit down there?
Sure.
Please. I don't want you behind me. No telling what you might do. Oh, okay. Sorry, that's okay. That you can point to something very specific. That if you look at how the churches deal with the nature of being human, and reflected in how they deal with the creation stories in Genesis, if you look at that, you can tell pretty much how churches will deal with transgender folks in their midst. That there are those churches who see human nature as fallen and broken, and of course, in my own Presbyterian tradition, totally depraved, and people whose lives are, totter on the edge of the abyss, hoping that they will walk the straight and narrow, and need God's constant structure and discipline, just so that they could possibly make it to the end of life and get into heaven. And there are lots of churches like that. The other side of the equation is a very different one, and it's one where the first creation story, where God creates humankind, male through female. I say it that way because that's really the Hebrew conjunction. Male through female, and God declares this very good. And human beings are created in the image and likeness of the Creator, the Creator's self. And those churches deal with transgender people very differently. And so through the eyes of those two kinds of churches, I want to bring you the stories of Sarah and her parents. Sarah, when I met her, came to a transgender support group that I've done in Atlanta for the last 20 years. Sarah was 17 when I met her, and she came to group with an older transgender person whom she had met over the internet. Sarah told, we got around the group. We have a talking stick. You have to keep transgender people in line because they really love to talk. And so you have to give them a stick and say, okay, it's okay for you to talk. And it got around to Sarah, and finally she started in on her story, and the whole group just remained transfixed as this very bright, very cute 17-year-old girl told us about her growing up as a boy in an upper middle class family in Atlanta as the only child, and her family, who had been church going and church leaders throughout the years, struggling with her as she began to struggle with her own gender expression until she reached the age of 16 and finally said to them, "Enough is enough. I really need to live the life that I feel is right inside of myself." And her Christian church leader parents did what their church told them to do. They kicked her out of the house. A 16-year-old transgender kid with no high school degree, no job training, no support structure whatsoever, was sent away from the house. And that was because the pastor believed two things: that Sarah would only relent and go back to being the boy that she was supposed to be if the parents treated her with the highest level of disdain, and that by allowing her in the house and by relating to her, that the parents risked their own eternal salvation. Those kinds of threats. Fortunately, Sarah found an older man who took her under his wing, and in exchange for some occasional sexual favors and companionship, gave her a place to stay and treated her with respect and allowed her to get a job where she became a waitress in a nearby eating establishment. She completed her GID. She went to college. She earned enough money in the 5 years after she was kicked out of home to be able to afford her own gender reassignment surgery. And I tell you, it is an incredibly expensive thing. And she did that all on her own while earning a college degree. What an amazing person. And the time for her graduation from college came, and she got back in touch with her parents, who had lost complete track of her. And in the meantime discovered that her parents had missed her terribly. They reacquainted themselves with their daughter, and they left the church. They turned their back on that church and walked away because the church had been so instrumental in damaging their lives and their relationship with their daughter. Story number one. Did that hurt? Yeah. It hurt me. It was a devastating kind of thing. Jamie is a different kind of person. Jamie is old. Jamie was 50 when I met her. Jamie was an engineer in a large factory in a state where she had grown up. And she lived in a bedroom community from a large city and belonged to the Southern Baptist Church in her community where she grew up. Any Southern Baptists? No. Or you wouldn't claim it, right? Okay. Well, this isn't as bad a story. Jamie Jamie's life had been rich and full, although she had lived her whole life as a single man, and when I met her, was in the process of transitioning again later in life, later than Sarah. Jamie waited until she was in her 50s, and had managed to get her employer on board with her gender transition, and everything was going smoothly for her. And she went to visit her pastor. She was a leader. She was a choir member. She was a liturgist. And she was on the, is it board? I think they have boards in the Baptist church. There's a board of deacons or something that she was on. She was a leader in this church and personal friends with the pastor. So she screwed up her courage one day and went to speak with her friend and confessed to him what she had been going through, that she was in the process of making a gender transition that she felt that she needed to make in order to maintain her own sense of self and her own ability to continue to live in the rest of her life. She and her pastor prayed, and they cried together. And the pastor said, I need to think about this. Give me some time. And so the next day, they talked on the phone, and the pastor said, I am so sorry, John, was his name back then. I'm so sorry, John, but I cannot see any way that this church can nurture you as you go through these changes. I just don't see it happening. I've spoken with several other people hypothetically about this situation, and I just don't see that there are people here who are going to be able to accept you. And yet, I want you to know you are such an important part of this congregation. Allow me to help you find a new place for you. And so they worked together. It took them several months. And they located a congregation in the United Methodist Church, of all places, in the city where Jamie could start going. And Jamie maintained some contact with her pastor, but moved her membership to the Methodist Church, and where she had been really baptized, of course. So they didn't have to worry about that. And became a church leader almost immediately. I mean, it was a natural place for her. She became a leading member of the congregation. She once again found herself leading worship. This time, the church embraced her, and not only did that congregation embrace her, Jamie became a spokesperson on a national level for the church's efforts to continue to be inclusive of LGBT people. And of course, as I'm sure most of you know, the Methodist Church continues to struggle with how it will embrace LGBT people. But this church and her pastor have become a place of great nurture, a warm hen coop for her to produce all the eggs that she can produce for the Methodist Church. And she's doing that in a wonderful kind of way. So her church, while they were like our Bishop Robinson's Hell and Brimstone church, the church had moved, and I'm sure the pastor had moved because of things that happened in the world, like this church, this one right here, right now, and the kinds of things that you say to the world around you in terms of what it means to be a follower. And like all of the people in the LGBT organizations that continue to try to speak out to the church, and the church members who continue to try to listen, and moved this pastor just a little bit, enough so that he could be helpful to Jamie as she moved along. My third story. So it's getting a little better. And this one is about Phyllis and Joe, a lesbian couple who Phyllis was a lifelong Society of Friends Quaker. And Phyllis and Joe got into a relationship, and Phyllis dragged Joe into the Quaker church, and they became members of the meeting in their town, and they even got married. I mean, the Quakers, they're all, they'll do anything in the Quaker church. I love the meeting, the friends. I love to go and sit and just. They're wonderful meetings, and so they were members, and they got married in the church. Of course, there wasn't anything legal about it because they were both women, but the church nurtured them as they decided to adopt 2 African American boys, which was cross-racially for them because they were both white, and so they were both women, and so they adopted 2 African American boys and put together a family. And then Teresa made her announcement, "Oh dear, I have to tell you, I've really always struggled with the idea that I'm really not a girl." In some ways, it was tougher in that relationship as a lesbian couple than it was in any other straight relationship that I've seen. They had to work it out with each other like crazy because Jo always thought of herself as a lesbian. That was who she was. That was her sense of herself, was a lesbian. And the idea that she would be married to a man was a tough one for her to get her arms around. And so they talked about it and negotiated, and Phyllis, who by now had become Jack, said, "It's great. I am going to introduce you as my lesbian wife, and there's no 2 ways about it if that's okay with you." And so they got legally married after Jack transitioned. This was even before last summer. This was several years ago, and established a family to raise their 2 boys. And of course, nothing is simple. Jack said a while, "Well, that wasn't the only thing that I had to tell you." The other is that I've experienced all my life a call to the ministry. Oh, this is a wonderful thing unless you belong to the Society of Friends. Because the Society of Friends, they're all ministers. There's no such thing as an ordained minister in the Society of Friends. And what Jack wanted was to go to seminary and become a minister. And so this church, this Quaker meeting, surrounded this family and assisted them while Jack went to seminary, and helped Jack become a minister in a Protestant denomination, and continued to nurture this family while the kids grew up. The kids are now in college, the 2 boys, and the family is doing wonderfully. Now, I'm not an expert on Quaker theology. I don't think they have such a thing. But what I do know is what the Quakers believe about being human, and the precious nature of humanity, and how beautiful people are, that each one of us has a place and a name in the place of worship. And so 3 stories, 3 very different stories. And I can tell you, I had to struggle with my ordination with the Presbyterian Church 20 years ago this year. And so over the last 20 years, I've gotten to hear stories of scores of people who have come to me, and I'm a psychotherapist, and so they come to me wanting assistance with their gender transition, but they come to me also because so many of them have grown up in the church. I have discovered over these years that there is a very close correlation between when one struggles with gender and issues of sexuality and when one wrestles with God. and people come as ex-deacons, as ministers in their churches, as choir members, as musicians, and look for a place. And the answer, if we follow the words of Jesus, is that the church must be a place of welcome for these people. Isaiah, if you go to the 56th chapter of the book of Isaiah, Isaiah, in talking about who can belong to the church, says that those who are different in this kind of way have a place and a name in the church better than sons and daughters. A celebrated place and a monument that will be kept for eternity. Throughout history, transgender people have been known to be particularly spiritually sensitive and leaders within their communities, and considered to be, even in cultures before Western religion got formed, people revered for their wisdom and for their knowledge because they had the experience of being beyond this gendered experience. So, you are on the cutting edge in doing this kind of thing, in inviting me to come up here and to begin to talk about how your congregation can open its embrace, not just to be accepting, but to celebrate gender in all of its flavors. I have to tell you, gender is not that you're not transgender or non-transgender, which is what we call cisgender these days. You're not really that way. We have all kinds of genders. People struggle. You've struggled with gender. Every single person in this congregation has struggled with your gender at some place in your life. It changes as you grow from childhood to toddlerhood to school age, to pre-adolescence to adolescence to adulthood to childbearing age, and then on into middle age and the senior years beyond. Our way of expressing and dealing with our gender changes. It's not the same. It's different. I'm sure that many of you ladies are not acting today exactly the way you did when you were 16. It'd be interesting to see what that looked like. And maybe that could be the subject of a party or a dance or something. Although we would have to probably not let the guys come. So I want to encourage you to come this afternoon and be a part of the workshop that we do. We're going to do some wonderful, fun things. I'm not going to make you change gender or anything weird like that. None of that. This is all going to be something that even an introvert can come and get through. And you're going to have a good time and leave feeling better equipped to embrace not just people who are different, who are gender nonconforming, who may come to the church. That's an important thing. I mean, when somebody who is obviously gender nonconforming comes into the church, we want to make sure there is a place for that person here, just like everyone else. And walking up and saying, we really enjoy having people like you in the church, is not a good way to do it. So, I've had that said to me. Oh, we really like having people like you here. I said, like me what? You have blonde hair? Is that it? But to be able to be open and welcoming to gender, to the ways in which we all do gender, so that we can enjoy those and not have them be a painful part of our lives and live with the joy of who we are. So, as Paul was telling Chauncey about carrying the basket back into the house with the eggs all proud, he got quiet. He put his coffee cup up on the dusty desk, and his hand trembled as he put the cup on the desk, and he looked at the cup, and his eyes seemed to go far away. And after a minute, he said, "I've got to go." And Chauncey said, "Why? We just got started." He said, I'm sorry, I've got to go. I've got to go to my grandmother's. I've got to go. I've got to leave." And he got very agitated and upset. And of course, this was a memory care unit. And so what had happened is this particular facility had built a bus stop out in front, out on the street. There was no bus, but there was a bus stop. And so they put a nice big bench, and they put a bus stop sign, and put a trash can, and made it look just like a bus stop, because they had been having trouble with the residents at their facility wandering off, and they found that the bus stop was a place for them to go that was off campus and still safe. And Paul started wandering out to the bus stop because he had to get home. He had to find his grandmother. And Chauncey walked out with him, and they sat in the seat at the bus stop for an hour. Chauncey didn't do anything like say, "Oh, you're really an old man," or "Your grandmother has long since been dead," or, "Please help me try to help you remember how you really are." Chauncey was willing to embrace and accept Paul where he was at that moment. And so Paul sat at the bus stop, trying to embrace hope for his life, trying to look to his own future, and stayed there long enough that another call came to him. It was his tummy. It's amazing how those tummies work. And he got hungry. And he completely forgot about that he had to get the eggs to Grandma. And he said he was hungry. And Chauncey said, "Well, we're in luck. They're just about ready to sit down for dinner. So why don't we go back in and have dinner together?" And Paul said, "Oh, that would be great." And Chauncey said, "I think that pound cake is on the menu tonight." Amen.